Freedom is a fragile thing and is never more than one generation away from extinction. It is not ours by inheritance. It must be fought for and defended constantly by each generation, for it comes only once to a people. Those who have known freedom and then lost it have never known it again. Those enduring words from President Reagan's inauguration speech are more important today than ever. Under the guise of public safety, governments around the world are curtailing our cherished freedoms and ancient practices. There is a risk that they will never be fully returned. We are now being told what stores we can use, how much we can purchase. Censorship in the media is more rampant than ever. Freedom of association and property rights have been abandoned, while people are now being fined for using a public beach. The socialist dream of a universal basic income provided by government is drawing ever nearer, with welfare payments and job subsidies merging and covering most of the population. The nanny state has been put on steroids, and no politician has missed the opportunity to pursue their pet cause. In Australia, there are irrational calls to ban any non-citizen from investing here. Well, perhaps those people can deliver that message to my friends in Whyalla, who are handed a lifeline by a non-citizen. Deficits, and hence the obligation we have to future generations, no longer seem to matter as magic pudding finance becomes mainstream. And years ago, it was only the kooky left who wanted one world government. But this week, the slightly less kooky and the usually sensible have made similar overtures. This is a dangerous time, and that danger isn't caused by the coronavirus, but by the government response to it. In the words of another former US president, if you want total security, go to prison. There you're fed, clothed, given medical care and so on. The only thing lacking is freedom. Stephen Conroy, you're not averse to the nanny state, but you're also a fighter for freedom. What's your take on what's going on in the current...
Well, I certainly think you're getting worked up there, Cory. I'm not quite sure you need to get as worked up as you are. I think that Australians are showing a very commendable, in general, willingness to curtail some of their normal freedoms and rights because they want to ensure that as few Australians die in this pandemic as is possible. So I think I can agree with a fair bit of your sentiment, but I think Australians have been pretty reasonable about what's happening so far.
Well, Stephen, before we go to Daisy, the problem is Australians have had 2 weeks in isolation. They've been compensated for it, and most of them are thinking this is a bit of a holiday. So the stress hasn't even kicked in yet. They don't know what they're missing out on, all the threats to it. But Daisy Cousins, you must have a lot more sensible approach to this than Stephen Conroy, surely.
Well, I'm actually appalled, Cory, at just how flippantly and quickly and willingly Australians are giving up their civil liberties. I mean, it's frightening. And I agree totally what you've said in your editorial about how freedom is only one generation away from extinction. I mean, very rarely in the history of our great world has it been that leaders have taken away freedom and just willingly given it back. And I think in Australia, we're also wonderfully spoiled. We live in the lucky country. You know, we've never had any major civil war or political upheaval. You know, generally we're very balanced societally, and most of us didn't live through World War II. So most Australians have no reason to be wary of a big government taking away freedoms, and they sort of seem to have a blind and very kind of sweet faith that they'll just all be given back. But, you know, if we look at history, that's not always the case, and I think people are going to realise very, very quickly after possibly, you know, a month of this, 6 weeks of this, that maybe they were very, very wrong in so happily sitting there and throwing this stuff away to the hands of Big Mama government.
Yeah, can I just add in that as well, Cory? I mean, maybe I'll go halfway to all of you here, maybe halfway to Stephen and halfway to yourself and Daisy. I think freedom is being curtailed for reasonable reasons here, and I think a lot of us haven't had every aspect of our freedom removed. I mean, after all, here's four of us talking heads having a chat on a Sunday night. Last time I checked, there was no government body sort of whispering in our ear like a Ceausescu Romanian authority saying what we can have and what photos of each other we can show and all of this sort of stuff. No one's being asked to worship Scott Morrison as the dear leader. There is a great concern, though, that if we look at China, we do see a society where freedom has been put under the tank. And that has obviously exacerbated the situation with this coronavirus. We had whistleblowers basically locked up, almost left to die. In some circumstances, they did die of the virus, trying to warn not just China but the rest of the world of actually what we were dealing with here, and that suppression of their freedom to speak, their freedom to alert the world, has clearly blown this virus way out of the proportion it otherwise should have been or should have been contained in. So you have a valid point there about freedom, but look, I think, Cory, all things have to be flexible, and I think Stephen later is going to give the Prime Minister a bit of a pat on the back for being a bit flexible with his ideologies. I think also all of us that believe in,
problem is,
believe in freedom the way you and I do, also have to understand that some freedoms have to be curtailed to fight this virus, and I'm pretty sure they'll be back in 6 or 8 months. I don't think we're going to be dealing here with some sort of Cuba or China.
I love the way that you want to justify some freedoms. It's okay to be curtailed. Well, I mean, when was the last time in Australia that we banned religious practices or gatherings? I can't remember that. That is the preserve of communist dictatorship.
1919 in New South Wales did it in 1919.
There we go.
Spanish flu.
When we were fighting fascism from 1914, we didn't have problems with freedom of speech back then. We didn't have problems with property
Cory, we're not fighting fascism. I mean, you and I are on the same political page, but you and I, we're not fighting fascism here. There's no brown shirts running around with germ logos on them. We're fighting the virus.
Be serious. If you look at what happened in South Korea and you look what happened in France, if you read about that in a really good article in The Australian on the weekend, two of the greatest spreaders were religious congregations, both in South Korea and in France. And they just went whoosh out there into their communities. They've been able to get them to a degree under control. But as long in Australia, I love Australia, as long as a policeman pulls you over, Cory, and says, what's your excuse for being out on the streets? And you can say a booty call. He goes, on your way, sir. You're doing okay. You're still all right.
Yeah, and you know what? In Victoria, you weren't allowed to say that last week, and until Daniel Andrews did it.
And common sense prevailed. Common sense prevailed.
Unilaterally, we've got Australian leaders around the country making decisions that are of questionable legality, and they're impacting I think, our ancient freedoms. And if we start to accept under any circumstances that this should be okay, then I think we are starting to lose the fight.
But what about the freedom of movement here, Cory? I mean, surely. I mean, you've been in politics, you know better than me. But surely there has to be, in the circumstances in which we're dealing here, there has to be a limit on the freedom of movement. Surely.
Okay. Now let me finish with this, and I want Daisy's opinion because at least she's sensible on this topic. The simple thing is that this problem has been conflated and overblown all around the world, because there are literally millions and tens of millions of people that have been infected with this virus. The mortality rate of it is probably about where a bad flu season is, and we have surrendered ourselves to politicians just claiming something and then curtailing our freedoms. I think it is a very, very dangerous precedent, and I don't like where this country is going to end up afterwards.
There's a flu vaccine.
If I might jump in here, as Cory mentioned, look, Stephen, if your barometer of unacceptable infringing on freedom is literal fascism, then I think you've been slightly spoiled, as I said, living in this lucky country. As Cory said, you know, the numbers of predicted deaths, for instance, in Australia are lower than we thought. So are the number of predicted cases. Yet we've been told that, you know, for instance, very basic freedoms like our freedom of movement are going to be totally infringed upon for at least 6 months. And to my knowledge, we haven't seen any modelling to justify this. Just a whole lot of sort of flustered politicians who I must say are doing extremely well with the hand they've been dealt, because it is a difficult hand. There's no precedent for this. I understand, of course, why we do need to have some social restrictions in place, but to just sit there and happily accept that everything is is going to be exactly the same after this is just ridiculous. I mean, if you look at 9/11, for example, that was when so many restrictions, for instance, were put in at airports and massive invasions of people's privacy as they go through security, etc. We were told, oh, that'll just be a temporary thing, fine. Well, guess what? It was not a temporary thing because there's always the threat of another terrorist attack. But I'll tell you what, after this, there's always the threat of another pandemic, and governments around the world can justify whatever they like if the population is even slightly living in fear.
I mean, the whole premise of your argument there was that deaths are relatively low in Australia. They're low because of the measures that have been put in place. And yes, the Prime Minister should have released his modelling, and he's going to, I read shortly, and they'll be releasing the if we did nothing, your sort of argument. And you will see the sort of havoc and the death and the misery that would have been caused if you'd have followed your logic.
No, you
well,
see,
I think
Stephen,
you've missed my point, actually, because I think you've missed my point,
Daisy.
Stephen, because as I mentioned, I did note, no problem, I did say quite clearly that absolutely I understand why there are some social restrictions in place, and I entirely agree with you that the reason the death rate has been so low compared to what was predicted was because we all have worked together and we've put in these restrictions. But as I will reiterate, we've not really been given any kind of justification for this in the long term. I mean, if the curve is certainly seems to be, fingers crossed, flattening the way that it is because of the way that we have all behaved, then I think really the government should be talking about some sort of exit strategy, because I do not want this kind of stuff to become entrenched, because 6 months really is a long time for this kind of big change to be in place.
Well, Daisy, I happen to agree with you, and I think that we've got a whole lot more to discuss in respect to freedoms, but perhaps we'll have another show dedicated to that. Michael, perhaps before we move on to your topic, you can sum up this topic for us.
Well, I think basically, Cory, maybe you should have summed it up. You and I might slightly disagree. But look, I think the fact is what we're talking about here is a general concern, and it doesn't really, well, it probably more so from the right of politics than the left, but we'll see. A general concern that hopefully at some point the restrictions which you and I might argue are necessary, or I would, maybe not you, Cory, will be wound back, and it's about timing, and I think the timing, like always, will be in the essence.